Is China's debt out of control? A lot of people ask this. Many people think so, but I disagree. Now, of course, I'm quite biased about China's governance, so I need to justify why I disagree, which is what I plan to do here. So wherever you are, welcome to another of my takes on China. And this one is based on a couple of questions on China's debt level that have been asked of me. And a couple of days ago, I was chatting with an English friend of mine over a coffee here in Zhongshan, and he said the same thing. He mentioned that China's biggest problem is the huge debt to GDP ratio. So I thought, I'll look a little deeper at this problem and see what all this fuss is about, because it's really not that big. Now, first of all, there are misinterpretations and issues here. What is China's real debt? What is the government debt? Whether it's a problem, whether it's not. Now, my understanding is that, as always, Western economists tend to look at China through Western lenses, and they have a very different view of what's actually going on with China than Chinese economists. So I'll come back to some examples of this in a moment, but let's remember the current premier of China, as well as the last one, are both world-class economists. If China's not going well, they probably wouldn't be in that position, and they probably are in that position because they know the challenges and have the skills and the leadership talents to overcome them. That might be why China's doing well. Secondly, there is a lot of bias when interpreting the data. So, for example, many American economists, they point a finger at China and assert it's on the verge of failing without looking in the mirror and watching the fact that their own system has all but failed already. Now, that's not bias on my part. That's a fact, and I will prove it here as we go through. So, I'm not an economist. I've read a few things, and I'm going to suggest that China's economy is not as bad as some wishful thinkers would like it to be. It's in no danger of collapse for a variety of reasons and because of a couple of strategies already implemented. It's in a great position to recover from every challenge that it faced so far. Now, there's another aspect that needs to be considered, and that is that there are always two points of view. Some are highly pessimistic and some are more optimistic based on experiences. I tend to fall into the latter, but I have some good experience in this country. I have seen how things have improved very much since I arrived here, so my optimism is based on realities rather than things that I'm reading. Now, China has many strategies. So cherry-picking one aspect of the economy or another is not helpful. Let's look first of all at the four main forms of debt that most people think of that China has. And there's some more challenging than others, but there are basically really only four aspects of debt to consider. That's total debt, which includes public, private, and sits at around 280 to 300% of GDP. That's high. The source of this is the IMF, so it's probably a very bearish source, although there's no reason to believe it's wrong. It's likely to be estimated at the higher rather than the conservative level. It's a number that seems to have most people concerned, but we'll come to why it's not such a big deal in a moment. Compared to, say, the US, it's not so bad at all. Theirs sits at well over 300 and is estimated to be probably closer to 400% of GDP, IMF figures. Next is government debt. This is what economists usually describe as debt to GDP ratio. The current is 75% of GDP. That's considerably less than the US's 124 and rising at the rate of about $1 million every 20 seconds or $4.3 billion a day. Their ratio is also much lower than Japan's. So if economists are concerned about China, they ought to perhaps look a little closer to home and see what they can do to help there. Corporate debt, which in China is high, it's about 160% of GDP, and so needs to be carefully considered. But it's not a risk because almost all of it is loaned to state-owned enterprises by state-owned banks. What China could do is restructure those loans, write them off, or sell off state-owned assets, which are huge, in order to reduce or remove this debt. But it's what China does with this debt that's important. And again, this is something else. We're going to come back to that in a second. Household debt is the last one, and that's extremely moderate by international standards and positively sluggish by US standards, which because of student loans, credit card debt, medical expenses, is somewhere around $18 trillion and increasing daily. China is also very much blessed in this regard because Chinese households, mine included, actually save more than they spend. There is far more in savings accounts in China than in debts, to the tune of about $66 trillion US dollars. So while there are some big numbers there that might at first glance seem worrying, there are a few cards that China can play. The most important one is that China has very little foreign debt. In fact, it's the opposite. China holds foreign reserves, including almost $750 billion US dollars, but that's not all. In total, including gold reserves, euros, British pounds, a few Japanese yen, China holds about $3.2 trillion, as reported by China's State Administration of Foreign Exchanges in April 2024. It's probably a little more than that now. There's another huge factor about debt, and that is what a country does with that debt. In China's case, it's built excellent infrastructure such as roads and bridges that connect regions, trains that transport people through those regions, universities that educate, and hospitals that keep people healthy and alive longer. Now, when you see what the debt is used for, the betterment of the population, but much more importantly, these infrastructure developments are investments in future growth. Growth is good. The pessimist may very well, as they often do, point out that this bridge or train line or road isn't paying for itself, but the region at the end of it is. People are doing better. People get richer, and when they do, they contribute to society, then more than they did before. Tax from the region grows and the road becomes viable because the region becomes viable. China didn't measure the cost of that road, bridge or train system against a 2, 3, 5 or even a 10 or 20 year investment on return. For that, they measured it in human capital. Will the people be better off? And if they are better off, then the country is better off. A village I went to in 2012 had a dirt road to the top of a mountain. Every person who lived there was poor. Adults left as soon as they could to work in one of the bigger cities. It now has a highway, it has hotels, coffee shops, it has tourism, and people are returning. 1,300 people who lived there and contributed very little to society, and now over 2,000 people who generate income, pay taxes, contribute to society. Young people who would have left have returned and turned their country homes there into museums, restaurants, bed and breakfasts. Visitors go there for the beauty of the place, and when kids graduate from school, they have jobs to do, income to earn, and taxes to pay. The road to it costs millions, but it's paid for itself time and time again in the rejuvenation of a dying village. Education is the same. Hu Jintao, more than 20 years ago, set up a growth strategy for scientific and sustainable development. He wanted China to be better educated. That better education has contributed to the growth of China's economy, much more than having a new university and collecting enough fees to make that university profitable. These are examples of how Chinese and Western lenses view things differently. China builds new universities to educate future generations. The West builds a new university with an eye on profitability and a 5-year return on investment from fees. Very different. In fact, China has established 63 vocational undergraduate universities in the past 5 years and is now home to 87 vocational undergraduate universities, 9,302 secondary vocational schools and 1,562 vocational colleges, with the total number of students reaching 34 million. These offer 1,434 majors covering every industrial category listed in the United Nations industrial classifications. That wasn't done to turn a profit. That was done to educate a generation, all across a 5-year term. Back in 2008, when most of the world suffered because of a US-induced financial crisis, they're almost all US-induced, Greece was in heavy debt to many countries. It effectively collapsed because other countries wanted their money back. The IMF restructured their loans, forced austerity on them, and it saw riots, protests, and extensive social disorder. Unemployment soared to over 25%. Youth unemployment was over 55%. They had international debts but no foreign reserves. Now, 15 years later, they're still paying off loans from the EU and the IMF. Many people believed their huge debt problem would destroy the European Union, and it almost did. Now, this is very different from the debt that China and even Japan holds, but not much different to the US and how the US structures its loans by having people pay debt bonds, hold US reserves. There isn't much glue holding the US house of cards together. So people looking at China might be forgiven for thinking or fearing that it's the same as America. It isn't. If you have debt and crumbling infrastructure, you're in trouble. You'll never be able to improve upon the crumbling infrastructure, and if something fails, you'll struggle to repair or replace it. Think about the Baltimore Bridge. China doesn't have this problem. It has modern infrastructure now. It's expanding that into rural regions. That extensive expansion, as itemized in the 5-year plans, create the infrastructure, not for growth, but for the betterment of lifestyles, health, and education outcomes, all of which stimulate growth. So China isn't as debt-ridden as many other countries, and that includes the number 1 and the number 3 GDP countries, the USA and Japan. China is in a much better position to manage the debt realistically, and China has invested what it's borrowed into a transportation system that earns money. Another myth that the trains lose money, they don't. It improves the opportunities of people either end of that train line to make more money. Hospitals in China are not, as some people might think, free, but they are affordable. Moreover, they're not a drain on the resources of a country like Britain's National Health Service. Medical health is government-controlled and marginally profitable. So borrowing to build a hospital or a train line is an investment, not a cost. Education in China is top class. More and more students are graduating with top-level qualifications, and they're contributing to the growing economy here in China. Debt that is manageable is not a problem. China isn't going to collapse because of debt. It uses debt to grow. China's debt is not an immediate crisis like Greece was in 2010. It has gold, it has oil reserves, it has, as I talked about a couple of days ago, soybean and other food reserves. It has coal, gas, and everything else it needs to sustain itself in reserve. And it has a well-trained, well-disciplined, well-equipped modern army to defend itself. And yet it doesn't spend more on that army than any other aspects of its economy. The Chinese government maintains significant control over the economy and the financial system, allowing it to manage debt more effectively. State-owned enterprises can access funding more easily, reducing the risks of more debt default. Many in the West will point at a huge business failures such as Evergrande and or Country Garden, but they'll fail to mention that they were the only two of tens of thousands of business developments, and all the others were survivors of the changes in policy and fiscal management of the property development market, the one that caused their demise. 2 of China's thousands of property developers collapsed too. With extensive foreign debt, both of them collapsed. China was a shaving cut, not a stab to the heart. Yes, it hurt, but that was all. Almost all of China's debt is held domestically, which mitigates the kind of risks that Country Garden and Evergrande were exposed to. And of course, the government can influence interest rates and repayment terms, and it can provide flexibility. China's debt-to-GDP ratio, while high, is not alarming compared to many other countries, and China still has significant growth, over 5% so far this year and the same last year. The ratio is often viewed in the context of China's ability to generate revenue and manage its fiscal policies. And let's be honest, if your GDP is growing in the region of 5% every year, then the percentage of debt to it is declining too. Something even China's worst detractors have to admit is that China manages these challenges well. What China did in the real estate industry, what it did to Jack Ma's and finance, how it manages the banks through rules and regulations, prove there is room for optimism and ongoing reforms. So for sure, as the pessimists often point out, high levels of debt can lead to financial instability if they're not managed properly. But is there any evidence at all that China's not managing it properly? I personally haven't seen it, but then I'm not an economist predicting yet another failure of China. Those economists who have been predicting collapse, many for over 2 decades, must assume that China is really lucky. But it does seem to me that the harder the Chinese government works, the luckier they get. Their concerns about transparency and the true extent of China's liabilities remain part of their strategy to condemn China. But I'd simply say they're looking at it as though America were running the country. And if America was, China would probably have more than half the country struggling from paycheck to paycheck, which it doesn't. China would have people falling into poverty instead of being lifted out of it. China would have people living on the streets because they can't afford the 3-month deposit on a rental property. China would have students in debt until they retire because they elected to go to a university. And China would probably have 10 to 15 or even 20% of its workforce doing 2, 3 or more jobs just to survive. China doesn't have that situation. Now, of course, there are risks. Michael Pettis, who, despite being extremely pessimistic on China, chooses to live in Beijing. He states that the country doesn't have a debt problem, but it has a growth problem. Debt can be a problem if it's not managed, he suggests. It can be a structural drag on growth and financial efficiency. But the real risk isn't default, it's slower growth, misallocated capital and reduced policy flexibility. I don't see any of that in China. And he's exactly right if it's not managed properly. He's another economist, not quite in the league of Peter Zien or Gordon Chang, who views China through his own unique lens, and he gets it wrong most of the time. I'm not concerned about it at all. In another year, those people will change the goalposts. They'll find some other single cherry-picked item of data that allows them to justify why they were wrong last year but are sure to be right this year. And millions of people will keep on believing them. Fox News will keep on paying them appearance fees. And China will keep on growing. Unless, of course, I'm wrong and they're all correct. After all, only time will tell. We shall see. Thanks again for watching, and please don't forget to like, share, and check that subscribe button. I will see you next time. Bye for now.